Alright, hey guys, so today we're going to be talking about one of my favorite openings from the black side, but more so from the white perspective today. We're going to be doing a tier list with the white pieces, assuming you're a 1e4 player. What should you be playing against Caro-Kann? That is the topic of today's video. And of course, as usual with my tier list videos, we're going to be starting down from the F tier, the bottom of the barrel shit that you don't want to touch, going all the way up to S tier, which is like, this is the very best lines, but also stuff in between. Of course, it is playable, but it is ultimately up to you. But without further ado, let's get right into F tier. And so for the very first line we're going to be discussing in today's video, it is going to be the Hillbilly attack. This one definitely is going straight into F tier. And basically the Hillbilly attack is when white goes in this position with bishop c4 here. But after d5, already this is very uncomfortable for white, and actually the majority of the players in the Lichess database have just played e takes d5, after which you basically just lose a tempo of this bishop, and now black has a very good version of the exchange variation, which we're going to talk about later. The Hillbilly attack, however, despite what most people play in this position, is not really where you take it. It's where you play bishop b3, you sack the pawn, and then you go queen h5 here. However, if common sense should tell you anything, it's that this probably isn't such a good opening. I think the main moves are black at g6, and black can also play e6 maybe, and perhaps this can be used in blitz as something slightly tricky, but if you really want a legit weapon against a Caro-Kann, this should not be your variation of choice. And so the second line going in F tier, this is also somewhat similar to Hillbilly in some sense, in that white often gives up the e4 pawn, is going to be to b3. This probably has some name, I just don't know it. So of course the line begins with b3 here, and basically black is almost always going to go d5. This is where again white could take, but then you just get a really weird looking exchange variation here, which isn't so good for white. So usually what white will do, at least the players who have kind of studied this, are going to play bishop b2, sack the pawn, and then they're going to play knight c3. But after just simply knight f6 here, white isn't really doing so well. They kind of have two approaches here. One is to play queen e2, and then after something like bishop f5 here, playing on castles, and then eventually they will either play f3 and just play this as a gambit, or try to play h3, g4. The one problem is if they try to do h3 and g4 here, just h5 is quite annoying, and then very often they end up resorting to simply playing f3 anyway. And to be honest, there's just really not much compensation in this position for white, so I can't recommend this. And the other approach with like knight e2 and going in this position knight g3 after g6, which I believe is black's best move here, what black is going to do actually very often here, just give back the pawn, or at least this is the best way to play here. And actually this position is not very fun for white to play. Their best moves to take here, but now they have a weird bishop on b2, they're not castled yet, their knight on g3 is sort of weirdly placed. It could get harassed by something like h5, h4 in the future. This pawn structure is very common in the Caro-Kann, this sort of Tartakower thing where they have the doubled f pawns, they have the c6 pawn over here, and white's pieces quite frankly aren't very well placed here, so this has to go in the F tier. Another line that is going to go in the F tier, as Ben Feingold would probably agree with, is going to be this line where white plays f4 on move 2. And so while f4 going in the F tier does kind of speak for itself here, I'll show just a couple lines here to really illustrate why. So after d5 here, the most common move that people will play in the database is either ed5, but again, this version of the exchange variation makes absolutely zero sense for white. This f pawn is just completely weakening their position, absolutely terrible. Black is probably already better here. The other sort of approach is e5 though, but the problem with these positions is that black just brings in light squared bishop out, and then these positions are very pleasant. Not really much to say. Sometimes white will go d4 here, and we really just have an advanced Caro with a pawn on f4, which isn't so good. It restricts the scope of this bishop, it just weakens in light squares a lot. Not a huge fan. Or they could also maybe go for something like d3 to blunt this bishop a bit, but this is just passive and you really surrender the center here, so this also can't really be too great. The one sort of approach which maybe somewhat justifies this, where you go d3, and then you try to keep this sort of pawn space advantage in the center, but unfortunately I just don't really believe this endgame here to be that amazing for white here, and I think black is already probably close to equal, although we probably do have to be slightly precise. Although yet again, it's like how many people are actually going to play f4 just so they can get this ending on the board? Probably not many, and even this endgame, as I already said, nothing too special. By the way, if white pushes e5, I think the point is we go knight d5, our knight's quite active, white can push our knight around more, but they're creating a lot of weaknesses in their position here, and they have to be a little bit careful about that. And on a similar note of weakening moves here, another line which is going to go into the F tier is one where white pushes their G pawn a little bit too early in the advanced variation. And so the line we're going to be discussing here, finally one that starts with D4 on move 2, the advanced variation. And the lines we're going to be mostly discussing in this video when I rank lines is going to be with bishop F5 here, and not c5, because after c5 here, in my opinion, white's only real move is to play d takes c5, and while I could just rank the advanced variation as one whole thing here, I don't think that does justice to the variety of options that white has here that are really radically different here and bring out a very different character in the position. For example, h4, g4, bishop d3, knight c3, knight f3, bishop e2. They all lead to remarkably different positions, and just putting them all in one box, advanced variation, that doesn't really make sense to me. But nonetheless here, g4, this is a move which I don't really like a whole lot, and there's a similar variation we're going to discuss later called the Shiro variation. This one I also don't particularly love. It's slightly better than going g4 immediately, the reason being that when you play knight 3, at least you control the e4 square. Whereas now when we play g4 here, black, instead of going bishop g6, which might be okay here, they have an even better move to go f3, sorry, bishop e4 rather, provoke this move f3 from white, then go back here. And basically these positions aren't a whole lot of fun for white. White's best move is to play e6 here, which is an idea we're going to discuss later. This is a very thematic thing that can happen very often in these lines, where h4, h5 is inserted for both sides, because whenever black takes now, they've created some significant, like, kind of weak light squares around their king side and center. It's very difficult to bring this bishop out now. So black's best move in this position after e6 is to go queen d6 here, and in general, these positions really aren't too promising for white. Black's going to play knight d7, long castles, hopefully e5 at some point, and I've never really had any fear regarding these positions for black. The engine even gives this around minus 0.4 here, take that with a grain of salt if you must, but it just goes to show that this probably isn't such a good position for white. Not too surprising when you look at all these moves they've made on the king side with their pawn advances. And also, just for illustrative purposes here, a move like g5 for white here, the reason they play e6 themselves is because if black plays e6 now, we have a perfect blockade over the light squares here. This is more of a positional concept rather than like opening theory, but this is just a hopeless position for white. All these kingside pawn advances, they haven't gone to create an attack now, they've just gone to creating permanent positional weaknesses. The f5 square or the light squares around the king side and stuff here. Absolutely atrocious for white here. Black's going to play c5, knight 6, bring the knight in here. Really not something you want to land yourself into. And so now we've got out of the F tier the variations which if you play, stop playing them. And now we're going to the C tier. These are ones which are like, they're not terrible, but they're not really inspiring. And I don't really see the point in playing them, to be honest. And so the very first one in the C tier is going to be the King's Indian attack. And so this one starts with d3 on move 2 here, and after d5, white's going to play knight d2. There's a similar variation in the French defense actually that goes e6 here, d3, d5, also by the name of the King's Indian attack. Of course, this is like a very universal setup which white can play against many different openings, but against the Caro-Kann, in my opinion, it's a very harmless line, the King's Indian attack here, precisely because black can play e5 now, unlike in the French defense, right? The pawn came to e6 already on move 1 here. It's very unlikely they're going to spend another tempo just like playing that pawn forward. But of course in the Caro-Kann we can do this in one move, and now to play typically continues something like knight gf3 here, bishop d6. We have some moves like these for both sides, very standard stuff. And we get to like a very typical tabia position here, where white has a couple different moves they can play, but if you switch the engine on, not that the engine should necessarily be the dictator of like every single opening choice you make, but it's generally a pretty good assessment for how dangerous this line is. And in this case, I think the engine already says black's like slightly better here. It says like minus 0.3, minus 0.2 around there, which for this early on in the opening isn't really a good sign. And not to mention here, it really does feel like we're playing for the black pieces here. Black has the space advantage, whereas white has the space disadvantage, which isn't really incredibly inspiring, to be honest. And I've always enjoyed playing these positions from the black side, so can't really recommend this a whole lot. However, coming back a couple moves, there is sort of one weird line here where white can go d4. It's not really a King's Indian attack, it just happens to arise via this move order. And basically white is just aiming for playing this move d4 here to sort of create some conflict in the center. Black doesn't really want to take this one. Their position's very loose now. This isn't good. So they usually take the d pawn instead. And after e takes d5 here, black could play knight f6 here and get an isolated pawn this way, or they could take immediately back and get an isolated pawn like this. And in both cases, black is kind of saying they're happy to get this, white rather is saying they're happy to get this sort of slight structural advantage. But even these variations, to be honest, to some players they may enjoy playing this, it's not really, again, anything too inspiring, and I would suggest look for something else. So the next one is going to be this line where white brings their queen out to f3 on move 3, or could even be on move 2 actually. So the line we're talking about here, it could arise via this move order with 2 queen f3 and then d5 knight c3, or it could be in this position knight c3 d5 queen f3. This is a variation which actually scores, funnily enough, quite well in the lead chess database here, with around 52% win rate for white, 43% for black here. But to be honest, I've never really found it to be so impressive here. I mean, first of all, we're just bringing the queen out. Like, yeah, we're threatening the pawn, of course, so black has to be slightly careful, but all things being considered, it's difficult to really believe in a variation like this, right? Basically, black has two main sort of good options in my opinion here. One is d4 here, and basically you have to be slightly careful about bishop c4 here, creating a counterattack on this pawn here, so you don't really want to take that. That's pretty suicidal. So usually you play knight f6 here, and white will play his intermediate move e5 here, trying to do all this weird stuff, basically aiming for this position here after e takes f6, and let's say takes here, where in this exact position black is actually up a pawn. But look at their development, right? This is absolutely atrocious, and after long castles, it's not for no reason that white has a pretty high win rate. You can't see it right now, I'm looking at it in the corner here, 67% for white here, and I think the engine's also saying this is like already +1 here. Definitely something you want to avoid is black. But nonetheless here, like, black isn't forced to go into this variation. Like, if I recall correctly here, there's like this very precise line where you go knight d7 here, you take here, and sorry, it wasn't that one, it was you go knight e5 actually. You get rid of this bishop now after something like queen e2, you take here, and these positions aren't really too inspiring for white, if I'm being honest. Another good line, as I mentioned earlier, is to play d takes e4 here, and after knight takes e4, the idea is basically just to go knight f6, basically asking white to take here, and once again we get this sort of Tartakower structure here, with the white queen sort of weirdly placed on f3, and it just sort of looks stupid, so black is happy here. White will usually instead play something like bishop f6, but again, I think after something like knight bd7 here, the position doesn't really make a whole lot of sense for white. Knight e5 is a threat here, and if you go d4, I think the big problem is just that knight b6 actually hits this, and it also creates this threat of queen takes d4 here, so white is actually seriously worse already in this position. So again, like, the line has some tricky points, but ultimately I just can't put it higher than C tier. So the next line, I have a feeling some of you guys might play this line. I really think you should stop playing this. I had a friend at the last tournament I went to, one of my roommates, we were looking at some stuff in the Caro-Kann. He showed me what I played, and I'm like, dude, do not play this line. It's like, it has some tricky points, but ultimately it's just not sound in my opinion. So basically the line goes with e4, c6. It comes from the advanced variation here, where white plays h4. This is technically called the Tal here, where black's best move is by far to play h5. You'll have some people play stuff like e6 and get their bishop trapped. We've talked about this before in some of my videos, like 32 ideas every Caro-Kann player must know. Good video, you should check that one out, of course, after this video is done. But after h5 here, black is generally quite solid. Also, I should note that if h6 here, this one isn't so good. Remember the e6 idea we showed earlier? Right, this one's very dangerous for black here. Like, the problem is that compared to the other variation, we had like a bishop on g6 here, was like the 4g4-1 here. The bishop was still on g6, we had a pawn h5, white had a pawn f3, so queen d6 eyed like the g3 square, for example. E takes f7 also wouldn't lure king to the f7 square. There are a lot of things really sort of going for our favor in that position, whereas this one's just utter crap, to be honest. You just don't want to go into this very depressing position. You run the risk very often of just ending up in this positional bind here, where you never get this bishop out. You have these doubled e pawns. Yes, we're technically up a pawn at the moment as black, of course I'm speaking this from, but ultimately this is just, yeah, you don't want to play this with black. This is, if I plug this into the engine, it'd probably say like +3. It says around +2.7, scores 83% win rate for white here. However, of course, the serious stuff is with h5. Any good Caro-Kann player is going to know this, and this is where white rather has a variety of different tries they can go for. The main three ones, a bishop d3. This has been recommended in a lot of like opening repertoire books, so expect to see this. We're also going to cover this later. c4, I think this is also like very good. This is critical. It hasn't gotten as much love in sort of chess books or any courses or anything like that, at least that I'm aware of. But there's also this bishop g5 one. This is a very degenerate move in my opinion, and yeah, if you play this, I really think you should stop. So basically, the idea is to cheapo black here with this line of bishop d3. You get them to take here, and then after queen takes b2, you play e6, and basically you just slaughter black here, because they take your rook here, you play queen b3, or you might take, no, I think you do this, you don't take here, and now the queen's trapped basically. If they take here, you play queen takes b7, and look at this. This is the absolute nightmare for black here. They're actually just losing. So that's why they usually instead like play something like b6 instead to protect the pawn. But then after knight f3, now you protect this. They might take here, but now you just castle, you develop the knight somewhere, you trap the queen in the next move, and you go home happy because you just you know, absolutely annihilated your opponent. And okay, technically black will have like 2 rooks for the queen, but it's very difficult for them to actually get their pieces out here because again, like these double pawns, they have weak light squares around the king here. Maybe our queen could sneak around like that. It's very difficult for them to actually just do anything. So pretty bad for black this position. The problem, however, is that black does not have to take and then get their queen trapped on the a1. They can take on d4 here. And now what happens if bishop takes f5, which seemingly hangs the pieces, that you take this, check, fork, good stuff. So white usually instead plays knight f3, protecting the e5 pawn, attacking the queen, of course, there. Black protects the bishop with queen g4, and then we usually get this position after takes here, where at the moment black is just simply up a pawn, and the white has some tricky stuff like c4 and castles, maybe, I don't know, but ultimately I've never been a huge fan of these positions for white. For example, after this castles here, I think the reason you have to be so precise with c4 is that now after f6 for black, this is very problematic. If you take here and black takes back, now you move the bishop somewhere, e5, knight d7. Maybe e5 isn't quite right. Maybe you just play knight d7. I'm not 100% sure. This is probably okay here. And if like c4, I imagine d4 is objectively correct, then maybe white can sack a piece or something and hope that because it's a blitz game, they'll get away with it. But as a classical chess weapon, this is probably pretty bad. Like, I imagine black is probably objectively winning here after like queen d7 or something like king f7. And as I mentioned earlier, like, okay, sure, you can play something like c4 maybe, and like this is maybe a bit of an improvement, but still, even then, you're down a pawn. The compensation isn't completely obvious, at least to me. Not a huge fan. And so the next 2 lines we're going to discuss are also going to be ones that stem from the advanced variation. These ones aren't with h4 though. This one involves a trade of light squared bishops. So this one again that stems from the advanced variation here with bishop f5, and here white goes bishop d3. I've talked about this a couple times on my channel here. One time in the 32 ideas video, the other time was like a speedrun video. I had some like somewhat clickbaity titles like 2.8 million players have made this mistake on move 4. I got a lot of hate on Twitter for saying this was a mistake here. I genuinely do believe that positionally this isn't such a good move. I mean, just after simply this, you're giving up your light squared bishop, all your central pawns are on dark squares. And like, yeah, there is some setup apparently where you can go like knight e2 and go for some like f4, f5 thing, which apparently somewhat justifies this. But still, it's like the majority of people who play this, they're not playing this as accurately. They're going like knight f3, c3, and they're basically just getting a bad version of the French advance, where, you know, usually you have your light squared bishop on the board, black has their bad light squared bishop, but now with those bishops exchanged, this is just the worst version. And okay, you can put the knight in e2, and again, you can push the f pawn, which is why I'm putting this in C tier. This apparently is somewhat of a dangerous plan here, but it's not dangerous enough or strong enough in my opinion to really put this any higher than C tier once again, so that's that for this variation. And as promised, another one in the advanced variation here, the Shiro variation, where we actually talked about this briefly earlier, but it shows on the board. So yeah, we talked about this variation earlier where white goes like g4 on move 4 here. not so good, but a slightly better version is where they go g4 here on move 5 now. Named after Alexei Shirov, who apparently every variation involving g4 is called like the Shirov Gambit or the Shirov variation. Great job, Shirov. However, to be honest, this variation isn't so objectively strong. It was very popular like pre-computer era, I think. But in the modern era with engines and stuff that are like playing stronger than Magnus Carlsen by 1000 elo, it's not really that dangerous of a line, and I've only really faced it once over the board. I think I got a pretty good position out of the opening, just because if you're well prepared with black here, it's not very difficult to get a good position. Like the theory mainly continues here with knight e2 here, c5, you go, I think it's h4 here. Black in response to this plays h5. Of course, they don't want to get their bishop trapped here. However, the main point for white is now they go knight f4, and they really just want to absolutely ruin your pawn structure here by playing knight 6 g6 and force you to take back with the f pawn. So a smart Caro-Kann player will not comply with that. They will play bishop h7, which to some people look like it sort of loses the pawn here with knight takes h5 here. However, the point is that after just knight c6, c takes d4 is also a move here, but I don't think by modern theory it's considered as good. Again, this is some nerdy stuff, right? But really, I just don't consider these variations a whole lot of fun to play from the white perspective here. Like, there's some cheaper lines you can try to go for, like with bishop h6, and hope they take and like blunder mate or something. But ultimately, I honestly can't remember what the best move for black is after bishop h6. I think it's like rook g8, but certainly I wouldn't base my choice against a Caro-Kann around this whole cheaper with knight o6 here. Like, all in all, these positions, black just has a lot of good compensation to the pawn. White's pieces, again, like the pawns are overextended, their knight's on the edge of the board, kind of weird. Black somewhat has a lean development, often gains an initiative very quickly, so yeah, don't recommend this with white. And so now, getting away from the advanced variation a little bit here, we're going to change the streaks a little bit and go and look at what is called the pseudo-panov here. And so the pseudo-panov here is where white plays c4 on move 2 here. The pseudo part is because usually the normal panov just arises via this variation where white plays c4. And white can technically transpose to the panov here if they really wanted to after this exchange and going d4, but usually when people play with this move order, they have different intentions and they usually are just going to take twice, where now black has a bit of an option. They could take here with the queen, but that's not so good because then white gains the tempo and then they get a good IQP position. So instead, black usually plays knight f6, and this is where the whole idea of the pseudo-panov is to play some sort of interrupting check here, like with queen a4, hoping that if bishop d7, this is not such a good move. There's a way to justify that with a very tricky line here, but usually what happens here is now black is just in a very uncomfortable position where their pawn is undefended on b7. They're no longer attacking d5 because the bishop's blocking the way. And there is sort of one underground secret I have here, which is that you can actually justify playing this line here with bishop d7. In fact, make it a very dangerous surprise weapon for black here, rather not for the white pieces, where you play e6 here. And you basically just try to like trap the white queen on a8 here after e takes d5. I think it's bishop c5, where essentially our idea is to play bishop c6 next, trap the queen like this, and if queen b7, the idea is to go bishop b6 and cut the queen off like that, and again try and go bishop c6 next. Although I think we usually have to castle, because if say we did bishop c6 here, that would run into bishop b5. However, most people when they face this line here, they're going to play knight d7. And even this line, there's nothing wrong with it for black. Is maybe even technically, objectively best. Black's is going to follow up with g6, bishop g7, castles next, a6, b5 eventually in the future, try and round up this pawn. It's playable for white, it's not bad, but I don't really understand why, if you know all this stuff, you would play into it. It doesn't make that much sense to me. It's not a whole lot of fun to try and hold into this d5 pawn the whole game. I mean, these pawns are doubled as well, so it's okay, but again, nothing too special. So finally, wrapping up the C tier now is going to be this knight e2 move on move 2. So this is probably the weirdest looking line maybe we're going to discuss in the whole video. It seemingly makes absolutely no sense to put the knight here on move 2 really, because after like this, what are we doing, right? The idea is to go e5 though basically, and after bishop f5, we could technically transpose into the advanced variation. This is a bit of a strange line where I'm going to combine it. I'm not going to make a separate thing. We're going to combine it into one here. Although technically, usually when people play knight e2 here. They're not gonna play this, but let's say they do. The idea typically is to display h4 and trap the bishop, where after h6, this is a bit passive, these sorts of positions for black to my knowledge here after like bishop d3. So the best move is to instead here play h5 and essentially embrace the fact that if white wants to take this pawn, that's okay with us, because now we're going to play c5, counter-attack in the center very quickly. And let's say like white really does want to play this, now they simply run into something like this, where they drop the pawn on h4, black is equal in material, and they simply have more active pieces, whatnot. Their structure is also going to be probably superior here. If white ever say like takes on c5, which they might be compelled to, since it's very difficult to actually maintain this strong point on d4, as after knight c6, and maybe bishop e3 for example, is going to be a very quick knight e7 to f5 here, or knight h6 to f5, piling up more pressure on the d4 pawn, which is very difficult for white to maintain. However, again, the main point that people are gonna kind of use when they play this line with white is they're gonna play knight d4, attack this bishop, and sort of leave the knight just stranded in the middle of the board seemingly. However, there is an idea here, which is to play either e6 or h4 and then go e6 here. And to be honest, I'm not really convinced this is that amazing, but some people, they like to just shove their pawn up to e6. However, after just simply playing knight f6 here, I don't really see anything too special for white here. They've played the pawn up to h4, they've inserted these moves okay, but aside from that, all they have to show is a knight on d4 and a pawn on e6, which they're probably going to exchange very soon. So finally, getting out of the long hellhole that was C tier, the very mediocre lines, which, I mean, you can play, but I personally wouldn't. Now finally getting to B tier, this is where we're starting to get some decent stuff here, right? Again, these lines, are they the best in the world? No, but they're better than the stuff in C and F tier, right? And so the very first one we're going to be covering is going to be, if I can find it for a second here, the fancy variation. And basically the fancy is where white goes f3 on move 3 here. It also has a pretty cool name. I mean, I just thought that would be worth saying, right? That always counts for something, I think. However, when it comes to the objective strength of the fancy, it's definitely an okay variation. A lot of strong players have played it, so it's not like it's a completely dubious variation or anything. However, personally, as a Caro-Kann player, I've never been afraid of it, and variations which I'm not afraid of, I tend to not rank very high. However, the reason I'm not afraid of it's very specific because of a line that I personally play against it and have found a lot of fancy players don't know how to deal with. But nonetheless, here, a lot of Caro-Kann players don't know the line that I know, and they will play something like d takes. This is the main line here where you go e5, and there's some stuff here where you get some attacking positions, a quick like bishop c4, sometimes you put the bishop on d3 as well. I've never really studied these positions from the black perspective because I've never really had a need to. I've always had the other line that I've been talking about. And to be honest, these positions do make me squirm a little bit from the black perspective here. White definitely does feel like they have some aggressive chances, and I'm not really sure I'm a huge fan of it. However, there's definitely some more solid lines here after f3 where black doesn't have to comply here and take and play e5, giving white the attacking positions they often sort of dream of when they play the fancy, and can instead aim for a more closed game with e6 here. And in particular for you Caro-Kann players out there, if you're watching, the line that I like here is to play queen b6 here. The main line is by far to play like bishop b4, I think like knight f6 might also be a thing here, and I think this might transpose into like a French defense here. But I mean, most Caro-Kann players aren't looking to play a French, so knight f6 is kind of a no-go. Not to mention the fact that white probably isn't even forced to play e5 here. But nonetheless here, bishop b4, never been a huge fan of these lines. Never really studied them either, so it's probably a bit premature to say something like that here. But queen b6 here has always felt like a very nice line to me, which is extremely rare, and maybe this is a bad reason to only put fancy in B tier. But nonetheless, it's a very difficult line to face with white here. If you just develop the bishop immediately, you hang the pawn on b2, which is why I usually play a3 first, but then after something like this, now bishop a3, the idea being that knight a4 just traps the queen. These lines here, I've never really thought were too amazing for white. For example, if you push e5, you hang this now, because if you take, bye-bye. And so in the meantime, you usually have to play some weird looking move like rook b1 or bishop e2, and yeah, I think that this isn't too scary, at least in my opinion. Another line which is also like decent but nothing too special is going to be the panov attack. The panov is essentially what occurs after coming all the way back here to move 3 when they take on d5 here. to begin with, and this is where white has a choice. They can play like bishop d3, the exchange variation, knight f3, I don't love. They have to play like a very specific way to justify this in my opinion. Or they can play c4, which leads to the panov attack, which often leads to positions where after some exchange of pawns, usually not immediately, because again, you allow white to develop in one tempo here. Not such a great idea from black's perspective, but just to show from a structural point of view here, usually you get some sort of position that looks like this, where white has an isolated queen's pawn, which is one of the key features of the panov. And if you like positions with an isolated queen's pawn, by all means, the panov is probably one of the best choices against Caro-Kann for you. However, from an objective point of view, the panov hasn't really been played or considered to be that strong for many years now. It's always kind of been there in the background as an opening line which white can play, but it really hasn't seen many like strong players take on as a consistent weapon, at least in modern times. Namely due to the fact, I think, that like, for example, after knight c6, these lines are very bulletproof for black here. There's stuff after bishop g5, like you take here on c4. These lines are very solid. I think there might even be something like bishop e6 here. And the lines of knight f3 instead, these are not known to be so ambitious here. This is sort of like a drawing line here, where after bishop g4, there's this sort of long force sequence here where you take, you go queen b3, you do this, e6 here, knight takes d4, I think it's bishop b5 check, there's this very precise sequence here, and now you play queen takes b5, and often you get this sort of endgame on the board, which white sort of has the slightly better chances in my opinion. Given that black has this isolated pawn, yeah, we do have the double d pawns. Black also has a slightly awkward king on e7 though. Like, all things being said, I think white probably is the one with better chances here, but I can't really imagine basing my choice against a Caro-Kann with this variation here. It's not the most ambitious thing in the world. But again, you could also go for something like bishop g5, a slightly more aggressive, sharp, more in the spirit of, I guess, a panov, you could say. Although objectively, this also, to be honest, doesn't really strike me as the best thing in the world. And so the next line we're going to discuss, it looks a little bit weird and it violates a lot of opening principles, but we're putting it in the B tier. It could even be maybe A tier according to some people. I think it was even recommended by Gawain Jones, the Grandmaster from England, in a recent book for quality chess. Actually, I think it was called like 1e4 Coffee House Repertoire. I could be wrong on that, but at least from what I remember, I'm pretty sure he recommended this variation here, which we're going to put on the board right now. So basically the variation is where after d4 here, d5, now, yeah, it could have, actually the move order we're looking at from is actually going to be knight f3 here. It can arise via d4, d5 though, and again, I mentioned how knight f3, I don't like it a whole lot, but this is a sort of one exception here, where if you go knight e5 on move 5, it looks a bit weird because you're moving the piece twice, and it also looks like black can just take it. Spoiler alert, taking it isn't actually that great, at least from what I'm aware of. But that actually is one of the big appeals of this line, because knight takes e5 is a very natural move for black here, trying to eliminate this sort of active invader in black's camp here, but at the same time, it's not actually that good of a move here. And also, I should just show the other move order which this occurs via. It often is going to be with knight f3 on move 2 here, d5, takes, knight e5, knight c6, and you could play bishop b5 here. This was sort of like the old main line, I think, here in this position, but more recently d4 has really become a bit more fashionable. And again, we have this position where taking is not too good. The whole point of this line, by the way, is that we get this sort of pawn e5, which is a bit of a thorn in black's arse. They can't play knight f6 very easily as they'd like to, which often means they need to play like e6 and develop the knight to e7. And it's also not very easy to get this light squared bishop out. They'd love to play a move like bishop f5, for example, but then this runs into bishop b5 check here, now bishop d7 forced to come back, and then queen takes d5, simply hangs the pawn. And if black tries to play something like a6, you just stop bishop b5 check, then just bishop d3 first, stopping this move now, which forces probably something like e6 from black. And given, you know, this pawn e5, which gives white very nice attacking potential here, this bishop which can't get out, white already has a bit of an advantage here. The one thing which I think, I mean, okay, there's probably more than one thing here, like if black just plays knight f6 here and just like completely ignores this knight and maybe plays e6 or bishop f5, they probably have an okay position. But I think the very best approach for black is to play a6 here. The idea being that now, if white plays c3 here, which they usually do as a bit of a waiting move, now black can play knight takes e5 here, d takes e5, bishop f5 here, get the bishop outside the pawn chain, play e6 next, develop the knight, develop the bishop to e7, then have a pretty harmonious setup, while white does not have bishop b5 check because of our very accurate move order with a6 and only then taking. Also note that white couldn't get bishop d3 in time here because then that would hang the d4 pawn, and maybe you can take here, but I don't really think this is so convincing. But when you take into account the fact, once again, that a lot of people aren't really going to know what to do with the black pieces from here, this really does make this quite a venomous weapon in my opinion with the white pieces, which is again why this goes into the B tier. So now up to the A tier, these are lines which I would seriously consider myself playing with the white pieces. Again, I'm not a 1e4 player, just to make that clear, but if I were, these are lines which would be serious considerations for my opening repertoire. First off, the two knights variation. So the two knights is where white doesn't play d4 here, they usually play knight c3. They could also play knight f3 first, but for some reason people like playing knight c3 first and then going knight f3. It doesn't really matter, but nonetheless, here we are, where black has a couple different options. The main one is bishop g4, d4, and knight f6 is also another one, where basically the hope is to get into a Tartacua variation here, where white usually doesn't comply with this when they play the two knights here. There's sort of a trend that has arose via the last few, I don't know how many years now it's been, but queen e2 is basically white's best choice now, backing up the knight like this here. There's some lines where, for example, black takes here. I think this is by far the main move here, but there's two different approaches really. One where black sort of tries to harass white for a queen trade here. I think it even goes as far as, like, let's say queen f4 here. Black will play like queen f5, they'll chase the queen around the board until finally they get their trade. But now these are conditions which white's quite happy with, and they'll play b3 or something, and this sort of pawn structure is an improvement for white here. They also score pretty well. I wouldn't be surprised if the engine says white's like slightly better. Okay, it says like plus 0.4. And there's also some other lines here, like where knight d7 happens, you go bishop c4, you go, oh, I'm so smart, I hang my queen here, oh no, black plays e6 here. And these positions also I consider to be like a bit better for the white pieces. Which is why a lot of Caro players will usually go bishop g4. I play this myself. Well, I haven't been playing the Caro as much recently, but when I was doing this, I usually would almost always play bishop g4 here. And you usually get these sort of positions, which solid for black, but also very solid for white here. There's a lot of different stuff you could do. You could go d3, g3, bishop e2, much more like solid approaches here, but you could also go d4 and sort of play this as like a gambit after these moves here. Queen takes d4 if you want to kind of go about this in a more sharp, I guess, way you could say. But all in all, the two knights has always struck me as a very solid way to play against a Caro with white. And I mean, the big appeal, especially with the bishop g4 line, is that considering that's the best choice, you often just get the bishop pair and then try to like slowly push forward, squeeze the hell out of black, which is very appealing to a lot of players who have that more sort of positional streak to them. They don't want to get into all these like very sharp, aggressive battles. Another line that I myself would seriously consider playing is the exchange variation. So the exchange variation is of course a line that happens with d5, e5 here, sorry, this one rather, and instead of going c4, which we saw with the panov here, or the knight f3, knight e5 one, you go bishop d3 and c3. Of course, you don't really want to play knight f3 because this allows the very annoying pin. A lot of our play is revolved around early on not letting black develop their knights with bishop very easily. And for example, the main line here goes knight f6. There's also some other stuff you play this in your study, like queen 7 and g6. Those are lines I like quite a lot here. But let's say the main line, knight f6, white gets the bishop out to f4, g4, black gets their bishop out. You pressure this, black defends it. Some moves here you don't really want to take, but these positions here are quite fun after like castles, rook e1. And we have a very just nice and simple attacking plan here with knight e5, f4. Whereas black's plan to play like on the queen side with stuff like rook b8, b5, the so-called minority attack, it's good, but they sort of have a bit more to be scared of in my opinion, because it's like, okay, if the queen side stuff works, they might have some weaknesses to target, whereas if our king side stuff works, they're going to get mated, which is, again, one of the big appeals of this variation. And it's also worth noting that when you play this, you don't have to know like massive amounts of theory. As you can see, the position isn't very forced, and we have a lot of like simple moves that follow a simple plan of attack. Which means that in terms of learning the opening, the so-called learning curve isn't very steep in my opinion. Once you get a couple games in, it's pretty easy to pick up and get going compared to some other stuff, like in the advanced variation, like for example the short variation we're going to talk about later, where you go knight f3, bishop e2. That stuff, like objectively it's very strong and it has a very strong positional foundation, but it's very difficult to learn and it has a pretty steep learning curve in my opinion. And so the next one is going to be similar to a variation we looked at earlier involving bishop d3 in the advanced variation, except it's in the tall variation with the moves h4, h5 inserted. So basically, again, it's from the advanced variation here, we see h4, h5, and now bishop d3. And basically the point is that compared to the position where the pawns were back here on h2 and h7 respectively, we're basically saying that we believe the trade of bishops now is very favorable to white, due to these like weaknesses that have been created. In particular, we can bring our bishop to g5 very often. For example, after e6, bishop g5, this is the thing. Sometimes our knight also likes to occupy the square here on g5. But getting some concrete theory, queen b6, knight d2. This line is something that black definitely should avoid. I don't actually like e6 despite how natural it looks here. I don't think it's the best move for black, because like if they take here for one, I mean, this is like very suicidal here. Sorry, that would be suicidal for white. But rook b7 here, like, yeah, we're up a pawn technically at the moment as black, but I mean, look at this here. Our pieces aren't developed. The only guy in the game is, or gal rather, is a queen. Something you should definitely focus on avoiding. So usually c5, I mean, is considered the best move. But after c4 here, like this is like knight e2, that's knight gf3. Really dangerous position for black. In general, the theme of these positions is black is going around grabbing material, white is just playing for the initiative, and is calling like all the attacking shots and stuff. So yeah, I mean, this is one of the big appeals. So again, this is why I'm putting in A tier, because this stuff exists and is very dangerous. Also, I should note, a lot of people just play bishop e7, but even these variations here, where we just exchange off the darks with bishops, sort of have like a good French in my opinion. We're just sort of squeezing away at black's position. Very often, we might have something like this, where we have a choice, do you play knight takes or h takes? H takes is very interesting, but again, you could also simply play like knight takes g5. However, the reason I'm putting this in only A tier and not like S tier is that queen f5 check is a very good move in my opinion after bishop d2. There's these positions which have been debated for a long time, and basically the consensus is that despite, like, okay, well, first of all, white has double d pawns, but black also has problems of their own. The e6 square is a little bit weak, the g6 square, the g5 square, they have their weaknesses of their own, also e5 not to mention. But these things sort of balance out for both sides here, and black is sort of doing okay. So instead, white usually goes knight d2 instead here, at least these days this is the most common approach. But even these positions, I've not really been massively impressed by white. Like, still there's some chances for an advantage and stuff, but yeah, personally, I'm pretty happy playing with the black, so again, I can only put this in A tier, I feel like. Another variation in the advancer is also going into A tier, is going to be playing knight d2 on move 4. And now this one is a very interesting line, let's call it. It looks a bit harmless playing the knight here to d2, but it shares a lot of similarities in my opinion with the short variation, which we're going to be discussing shortly. But the whole point compared to these lines is that when you play knight d2, you cut out a lot of variations where black plays an early c5. Like, yeah, it still is possible, but generally it's not considered to be as great. I believe the reason is that usually you just take here, you get the bishop here, and because again of the placement of the knight on b3, and like, okay, the engine might say it's around equal, but from a practical point of view of the bishop pair, you sort of just say that, like, okay, I'm pretty happy with how I'm doing here. And then if black plays something else other than c5, you just play in similar style to the short variation, develop your bishop to e2, and you get some sort of like slow setup here where you have pretty decent chances for an advantage in my opinion. But again, the positions are very strategically complicated. You really need to make sure that you have a good understanding of these positions. Otherwise, you're going to feel very lost and you're probably just going to get outplayed by your opponent. And so the final line going into A tier, I was deliberating, do I put this in A tier or B tier? It could go either way, but to be honest, I'm going to end up putting this in the A tier. And so this line is where on move 2, white will play knight f3 instead of going d4. And then instead of like taking here or knight c3 or any of the other stuff we've seen so far, white's going to play d3 here, which looks a little bit silly here because after this, we allow an exchange of queens, our king can't castle anymore, and usually this sort of thing isn't considered to be so good. However, this is kind of an exception, I feel, and this endgame black has to be very careful to actually equalize. Already, like, if bishop g4, the most common move in the database by far, knight e7, let's say, white has a very strong move knight e1, when after this sort of position, white actually scores extremely well here, like off the charts, like 60% or some ridiculous crap like that. And even the engine evaluates this very well for white, like already close to +1. And to a lot of people, that's going to be like, what the heck? Like, how is this +1? It's like equal, isn't it? But the whole point is that we've traded off the knight squared bishops, black's good bishop, our bad one, if we look at the central pawn structure. And now after black has played e5 combined with c6 being played, the d6 square is rather weak. So very often we're just going to sort of squeeze away at these factors here, play something like knight d2, knight c4, maybe a knight into d6 one day hopefully. And this is just actually surprisingly a very passive position for black to play. It's very difficult to really figure out what to do. So the best move actually isn't even to play bishop g4. This is already somewhat inaccurate, I guess you could say. The best move is knight f6, and white's going to play this very accurate move, knight of d2, clearing the space for the pawn to come to f3. And these positions still, they're not very clear cut to play. Again, you don't really want to play e5 because f3, and I think white still has some chances for a nice slide edge. Instead, the best approach is basically, most players, if they're below 2000, probably aren't going to know this, where it's like you play h5, g5, some knight g4 stuff, like for example h5 here, f3, g5, you go here, let's say a4, h4. This is legit theory actually for black, and I think according to the engine, black's like slightly better, but okay, white could probably play some better moves along the way. But the point is that, like, if your opponent's me, I'm gonna know this, but if your opponent is some random person who doesn't really study theory well, and chances are if they, well, especially this line in particular, if they haven't studied this, which most players probably have not got around to yet, there's a lot of potential. So even though objectively in this line here, black goes very precise moves like h5, g5, how many people know this? Probably not a lot, which is why I'm putting this in A tier. If you like endgames in particular, this line is a very good choice for you. And honestly, if I play e4 one day, I would strongly consider playing this line myself. So finally, we are up to S tier now, the very best of the best, at least in my opinion. So first of all, we are going to be putting the classical variation in S tier. And you know, I know some of you might be like, why is there just one thing dedicated to the classical variation and like 10 to the advanced variation? But the thing for the classical is that generally white tends to play in a very similar way each game, whereas in the advanced, a lot of the approaches are radically different, which is again is something I discussed earlier, I think all the way back in F tier, but I know some of you may have skipped over that part. So of course the classical variation is where white goes knight c3 here. Knight d2 will also technically transpose after d takes e4, knight takes e4, but for our purposes, let's say knight c3 here. Takes, and I mean black has a bunch of lines here like bishop f5, knight f6, knight d7, all respectable lines. I've always liked bishop f5, knight f6 is what's trendy these days. The attack what this leads to. We've looked at this pawn structure a bunch of times throughout this video through other lines, but now we finally get to see the beast in its most pure form itself now. And really, I mean, it's just been one of the most sort of like time-tested variations against the Caro. It has periods where it's like not seen as much. Some periods, especially these days, where like the advanced is sort of like the hottest thing. But I think the classical will always be there as a variation which people come to every now and then at least. Of course, like the main line is like with bishop f5, we have this stuff, and the classical variation of bishop f5, which will always, like these days I think people have actually been trying like not to play h5 here, which I always was sort of curious about back when I started playing the Caro-Kann, but there weren't really reference games to look at to see like how good is this approach here. It's only really recently that people have sort of been testing the waters with like, should we actually not insert h5 here? And I think that's sort of a bit of a new testing ground for the classical variation. Whereas the old main lines had these moves inserted, and I mean, just to be honest, I mean, these lines are very logical. It's classical variation for a reason. Usually anything that has or a classical variation in it usually means it's pretty sound. You can play it without knowing ridiculous amounts of theory. Of course, knowing theory helps, but all in all, as a reliable weapon like the classical, it's something you can't go too wrong with. And so next up, this is actually, in my opinion, like the very most critical variation against Caro-Kann, the short variation, named after Nigel Short, which occurs in the advanced variation. So we've mentioned this a couple times in the video, briefly referring to it, but now we're finally going to get the beast on the board here. This is a short variation. There's a lot you have to learn here if you want to play it, but if you're a strong player, like at least 2,000, I'm not sure how many of those of you there are that are watching my videos, but if that is you, like, give this variation a shot. Like, really, if you have big goals especially, this variation is like, this is top shit basically. There's a reason that, like, this is the variation which a lot of like the very top players play when they face Caro-Kann, is because this is top of the shelf stuff. There's a lot of lines you have to learn. That's a problem though. Like C5, there's a lot of sharp fury you need to learn, and the character of the nature of the positions will drastically differ depending which variations you look at. For example, the C5 lines immediately, this is very principled. Black is going to immediately after bishop e3 here. There's lines of queen b6 where they target this, and in those lines you actually have to make sure you really know your theory, not only to get an advantage but to make sure you actually don't end up just worse, so keep that in mind here. And then there's also lines of like c takes d4, knight e7, which also can run quite deep, and you really have to know your stuff here if you want to get anything out of the opening. But then the non-c5 stuff where black goes like for much more setups like here where they just play knight e7. Sometimes they play like h6, they play knight c8 and bishop e7, or they just like slide bishop back to g6. There's a whole lot of different stuff that black can do. And these positions, it's less about memorizing concrete theory. There's definitely an element to that, but really making sure you understand how to play these very close positions, the methods that you can use to really squeeze black here. That is really what's important. You're going to have to study a fair bit to really understand and make this line work for you. But if you do that, I think it's really worth the payoff, because objectively this is a very strong line for the white pieces. And so the final line here, this is a line which I myself, when I played the Caro-Kann, I struggled a lot against. It's very strong. I wouldn't say it's quite in the same boat as a short variation, but for more aggressive players, this is definitely something you want to consider in my opinion. So basically the line, it starts with the tile variation here in the advanced line, where instead of bishop d3 and the dodgy bishop g5 stuff we looked at earlier, c4 is the other sort of critical line, where there's a lot of different stuff that can happen here. Knight e7 was sort of like the long-standing old main line, but these days dc4 apparently is like some fury. I'm just sort of like parodying what I read in the Lifetime Repertoire chessboard course by Erwin Me. I think he recommended this, at least from my slightly dodgy memory. But to be honest, like these positions, the thing I always found difficult about it was black's play was never as clear cut in some of the other variations. There were no like forcing equalizers or anything. And even if the engine said you were equal, the positions would always feel complicated and quite difficult to play. Not to mention, a lot of strong players, quite aggressive ones, have quite liked this a lot from the white pieces, which, if any indication of this variation being critical, I believe is one. But nonetheless here, that just about wraps up this video. This was an extremely long one. I don't know what it's going to come out to when I edit it. Probably well over an hour though, so if you stuck around till the end and if you actually watched the whole thing, like, good job I guess. I mean, it's a lot of stuff to really digest, but hopefully it has helped you in some sort of tangible way, and that you were able to come out with this with a pretty solid weapon against the Caro-Kann, or just learn something. I don't know if that's your thing. You enjoy me ranting about openings for like a whole hour. But yeah, if you stuck around to the end, I mean, like the video of course, and subscribe if you're not already. I mean, if you watch a whole 1 hour video and you're still not subscribed, I mean, please do. And also leave a comment down below if there's any other videos like these you want to see from me, any other tier lists, opening masterclasses, whatever. Let me know, and I will see you until next time.